Ever wonder what happens when someone gets on a king's bad side? Well, buckle up, because what Henry VIII did to people who crossed him will make every revenge story you've ever heard look like a friendly disagreement. In 1531, this king didn't just execute his enemies, he literally boiled them alive in public, creating a new law specifically to make their deaths as agonising as possible. We're talking about a ruler so paranoid about being poisoned that he invented an entirely new method of torture just to send a message. What you're about to discover about Henry VIII's most brutal punishments will show you that his reputation for beheading wives was just the tip of the iceberg. Let's start with the day a simple cook became the first victim of the most horrific execution method in English history. On February 18, 1531, something happened at the Bishop of Rochester's residence in Lambeth that would transform English law forever. Richard Rose, the household cook, was preparing the daily meal for Bishop John Fisher and his guests. But this wasn't going to be an ordinary lunch. It was about to become the catalyst for one of history's most cruel execution methods. Rose added a mysterious white powder to the porridge being served to the bishop's dining guests, household servants, and even the poor people who came for charity meals. Within hours, 17 people were violently ill. 2 of them, a household member named Bernard Kerwin and a beggar named Alice Trippitt, were dead from what was clearly poisoning. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. Bishop John Fisher wasn't just any random clergyman. He was one of Henry VIII's most vocal political enemies, a man who had publicly opposed the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon and his break with the Catholic Church. Fisher had been a thorn in Henry's side for years, constantly challenging the king's religious and political authority. When news of the poisoning reached Henry VIII, the king didn't see it as a simple case of food contamination. He saw it as a direct attack on the crown itself, and possibly evidence of a broader assassination plot targeting his enemies. Henry VIII was already notorious for his paranoia about being poisoned, but the attack on Bishop Fisher sent his fears into overdrive. Despite the fact that poisonings in England were incredibly rare, Henry had developed an almost pathological terror of someone slipping something deadly into his food. He employed multiple food tasters, required elaborate preparation rituals, and flew into rages at the slightest suggestion that his meals might be tampered with. The ruse case hit every one of Henry's psychological triggers. Here was proof that poisoners were actively targeting his political opponents. If they could reach a high-ranking bishop in his own residence, what was stopping them from reaching the king himself? Henry didn't just want to punish Richard Rose. He wanted to create a punishment so horrific that no one would ever dare attempt poisoning again. The king personally became involved in Rose's case, demanding that Parliament create an entirely new category of crime just to deal with this situation. Henry called an emergency session of Parliament and delivered a speech that lasted over an hour, ranting about the evils of poisoning and the need for justice that matched the severity of the crime. The Spanish ambassador wrote that Henry seemed more obsessed with this case than with any of his ongoing political crises. Within weeks of the poisoning, Henry VIII had convinced Parliament to pass the Act for Poisoning, a law that made murder by poisoning a form of high treason, regardless of the victim's status. But the real horror wasn't in the new legal category, it was in the punishment Henry specified. Anyone convicted of poisoning would be boiled alive in public. Henry didn't choose hanging, beheading, or even the traditional drawing and quartering reserved for traitors. He specifically chose boiling because it would be slow, agonising, and impossible to ignore. The king wanted everyone in England to understand exactly what would happen if they crossed him. The law also removed what was called benefit of clergy, a legal protection that allowed educated people to avoid the harshest punishments. Henry made sure that absolutely no one would escape the full horror of his new execution method. Richard Rose became the first victim of Henry's sadistic innovation. He was tortured until he confessed, claiming the poisoning had been meant as a prank to make people sick, not to kill anyone. Henry didn't care about Rose's motives. He cared about the message his execution would send. On April the 15th, 1532, thousands of spectators gathered at Smithfield in London to witness something that had never been seen before in English history. Richard Rose was brought to a specially constructed platform where a massive iron cauldron of water was being heated over a roaring fire. The execution wasn't designed to be quick. Rose was chained to a pulley system that would lower him into the boiling water 3 times over the course of roughly 2 hours. The first dip was brief, just long enough to start cooking his skin. Then he was pulled out, left to suffer, and lowered again for a longer period. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that still make historians uncomfortable to write about. A chronicle from the time reports that roos roared mighty loud, and that pregnant women in the crowd became sick and had to be carried away. But other spectators apparently weren't bothered by the horror. They watched with fascination as a human being was literally cooked alive. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. Roos's skin began to peel off in the boiling water. His screams echoed across London as thousands of people watched him die in the most agonizing way possible. The execution of Richard Roos wasn't a one-time event, it was the beginning of a systematic campaign of terror that would define Henry VIII's reign. Within months, more people were being boiled alive under the new law. A maidservant was boiled at King's Lynn for poisoning her mistress. In 1542, Margaret Davy was boiled at Smithfield for poisoning her employer. Henry's paranoia about poisoning became a convenient excuse for eliminating anyone who opposed him. The definition of treason kept expanding, and the threat of being boiled alive became a tool for political control. Over the remainder of his rule, an almost unbelievable 72,000 people were executed under his orders. The king had discovered that the mere threat of horrific death could be more powerful than armies in controlling his subjects. The boiling law stayed on the books throughout Henry's reign, a constant reminder that crossing the king meant facing the most agonizing death imaginable. Every political opponent, every religious dissenter, every court rival knew that they were just one accusation away from being cooked alive in front of cheering crowds. You'd think that a king who boiled people alive would be remembered as one of history's greatest monsters. Instead, Henry VIII is often portrayed as a larger-than-life character, a charismatic ruler who broke with Rome and created the Church of England. Popular culture remembers him as the king with 6 wives, not the paranoid tyrant who invented new ways to torture his subjects to death. The boiling law was so horrific that it was repealed almost immediately after Henry's death by his son Edward VI, who declared it too cruel to ever be used again. Even by 16th century standards, when public executions were common entertainment, boiling people alive was considered beyond the pale. Henry had proven that absolute power could create new depths of human cruelty, and that the right combination of paranoia and authority could turn a king into a monster who made up tortures that would have impressed medieval inquisitors. So here's the question that historians still debate. Was Henry VIII the strong king who protected his throne through necessary brutality, or was he a paranoid monster who used the law as an excuse to torture his enemies in the most horrific ways possible? The records are clear about what happened. Henry VIII did create a law specifically to boil people alive. He did personally involve himself in these cases. He did turn execution into public spectacle designed to terrorize potential opponents. And he did use the threat of agonizing death as a tool of political control. But the moral calculation is more complicated. In an era when assassination attempts against rulers were common, was Henry's paranoia justified? When political opponents could destabilize entire kingdoms, were extreme punishments necessary to maintain order? Does the effectiveness of terror as a political tool excuse its brutality? These are the questions that make Henry VIII one of history's most disturbing figures. He wasn't just a king who killed his enemies, he was a ruler who turned human suffering into performance art, who made public torture into a form of government policy. The man who created the Church of England also created some of the most sadistic execution methods in European history. The king who's remembered for his marriages should also be remembered for the people he boiled alive in public squares. Henry VIII proved that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it can transform human beings into monsters who invent new forms of cruelty that shock even their own contemporaries. What do you think? Was Henry VIII protecting his throne through necessary brutality, or was he simply a sadistic tyrant who used the law to torture his enemies? Let me know in the comments below.